can't walk, spilling her drink everywhere, playing the band's guitar up on stage. Bouncers have to drag her down. Something's not right. Mr. Hobson, Vanessa's friend, asks again, aren't you going to be the designated driver? Anyone can have a few drinks and be okay to drive. That was the defendant's mentality that night, members of the jury. What did she do? After drinking for 12 hours, having upwards of 11 drinks, she refuses a cab, doesn't call anyone to come get her or friends. She gets in the car with a girl who's now dead. She drives down a dark road in the rain. She can barely hear, she can barely see. It's loud, it's raining. She doesn't pull over. Nothing could stop the defendant from drinking that night. Nothing could stop the defendant from driving except for that tree that killed Vanessa Sullivan. Members of the jury, the defendant is the reason that Vanessa's father had to get that call that every parent fears. And that's why we're here today. As the state, we came before you, we had a burden to prove to you. We had to prove that the defendant was driving under the influence of alcohol, and that because the defendant was driving under the influence of alcohol, she murdered Vanessa Sullivan. And we had to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. I want to make one thing really clear. That does not mean beyond all doubt. We know that when you go back in that jury room to deliberate, you're going to have questions. You might have questions about what happened today here in trial. You might have questions about what happened the night that Vanessa died. But I want you to think back to trial. And I want you to remember that we provided you answers to those questions so that you don't have any reason to doubt. And when you go back in that room to deliberate, the judge is going to read you this piece of paper. I understand there's a lot of stuff on this, but there are 3 things that I want you to pay attention to when you have to make your decision. The first is that the defendant was under the influence of alcohol. What did you hear today? Every single expert in trial today agreed that the defendant was too drunk to drive. More than that, members of the jury, the defendant knew she was too drunk to drive. You heard Sister Bennett tell you that at the scene of the accident, the defendant said, "So stupid. Why did I let them make me drive when I knew I was tipsy?" Members of the jury, at the very least, the defendant was under the influence of alcohol the night she killed Vanessa Sullivan. The next thing I want you to pay attention to is this word up here. In order to prove murder, what makes this different from any other kind of murder trial you've probably heard of, in the absence of intent, we have to prove recklessness, extreme recklessness. The judge is going to tell you what that means. That means that the defendant ignored a substantial and unjustifiable risk. Something that a law-abiding person wouldn't do. Not a law-abiding person, that's those of us for whom the law still means something. Those of us who respect the law that you've been brought here to uphold. Members of the jury, ask yourselves, would a law-abiding person, after drinking for 12 hours in a bar, and not just getting a little tipsy, but falling down, stumbling, spilling her drink, playing the band's guitar drunk, would a law-abiding person get in a car and drive their friends home? And what justification did they give? Last thing you have to make your decision on is that the defendant had an extreme indifference to human life. It's another thing that makes this case different from a murder with intent. Extreme indifference is just as bad as if the defendant had planned this murder for months. Because the defendant did not care about the lives of the people in her car. And it wasn't just that the defendant was drunk, it wasn't just that the defendant was speeding, it's that she did it in the dark, in the rain, on a road she knew was dangerous. Lined with trees, she could barely see, she could barely hear, and she didn't do anything about it. She went faster. She didn't care. That's why Vanessa Sullivan is dead. Every year on Vanessa's birthday, her parents don't get to celebrate her birthday, the birthday of their only daughter. Instead, they get to put flowers on a cross on the side of Canaan Road. Because the defendant was supposed to be the designated driver. The defendant was the designated driver who drove drunk. And because the defendant was the designated driver who drove drunk, Vanessa Sullivan is dead.